Hello everyone, and welcome to the first episode of the ASEN book presentation series, in which we will showcase the latest books on nationalism, territorial politics, populism, and ethnic studies. I am your host, Javier Carbonell, and I am very pleased to have Dani Cetrà as our very first guest. Dani is a research fellow at the Center on Constitutional Change, and he collaborates with the Open University of Catalonia, teaching in the field of comparative politics. Today we will have a conversation about his first book, Nationalism, Liberalism, and Language in Catalonia and Flanders. At the end of the interview, the audience members will have the chance to ask Dani any questions they wish by using the chat functions in both Zoom and Facebook. In addition, if you have any technical issue, please also ask them using the chat functions and we will help you. Having said that, we'll get right into the interview. So the first question, Dani, is how did the idea of the project came about and what literature are you responding to?
The topic of how to reconcile liberalism and nationalism as two ideologies that are fundamentally interested in different issues, one individual rights and the other one national communities, has always been very interesting to me. So the origin is fundamentally an intellectual one. I wrote my bachelor's thesis on this topic, then my undergraduate dissertation on this topic, and part of my master's dissertation on this topic. So it's a long-standing interest of mine in this theoretical debate, and particularly in the way this debate is implemented or takes form on the ground in the real world. And obviously, being Catalan myself, I was exposed to these debates around language in Catalonia, in which the Catalan linguistic policies, and particularly the use of language in education, have been from the outset contested on liberal grounds, on the fact that these policies, while they enjoyed consensus at the political level within Catalonia, they were challenged by vocal minorities within Catalonia on those grounds that these measures were reprehensible, were illiberal, and therefore could not be supported. So that seemed to me an interesting empirical instance of these broader debates. And then I learned from the Flemish case through a good friend of mine from Barcelona, who was raised in Sint-Genesius-Rode, one of the 6 Flemish municipalities around Brussels, which are monolingual in Flemish, but enjoy linguistic facilities for French speakers. He was raised there, and he would always or sometimes talk about the controversies arising from this difficult context in which there's a vast majority of French speakers in the territory, but the territory and the municipality is only monolingual in Dutch officially. And that sparked an interest too in the case of Belgium more generally as an empirical instance of these debates. So this would be the origins of the book and my interest in these topics and cases. I was trying to insert myself in debates around liberalism and nationalism, and particularly to complement previous work that had been done, especially on the Catalan case, in which particularly political philosophers tried to assess the liberal character of the Catalan linguistic policies, trying to assess whether they were liberal or illiberal. And while I found those contributions very, very interesting, one of the problems with that approach is that the Catalan linguistic policy, and any policy for that matter, may be considered liberal or illiberal depending on what strand of liberalism we embrace. And that doesn't take us very far analytically. So I try to insert myself in that debate by focusing more on claims and trying to place the claims of actors on the ground in broader theoretical debates, rather than in assessing the liberal character or illiberal character of the policies, of the controversial policies. I also try to insert myself in debate around language justice, which is a subfield within contemporary political theory concerned with the fair involvement of political authorities with language and the value of linguistic membership for individuals. And I tried to do so by stressing that the connection between language and individuals, sometimes it's created, it's mediated, and it's made meaningful through nationalism, that this connection, that language justice theories sometimes shift directly from individual to language. And I thought there was something missing there. And that connection was nationalism and the national construction of languages as meaningful identity markers. So that's where I try to place the contribution, and those were the origins that led me to that.
No, thank you very much for that. Before I ask you the next question, I just want to repeat to any audience member that has just joined in that you can ask any question to Dani using the chat functions both on Zoom or on Facebook, and we'll ask them at the end of the interview. So, I mean, now to the big question, which is simply, what is the main argument of the book? If you had to summarize it, what is the main contribution and what are you defending?
Mm-hmm. Well, before I summarize the book, allow me to say a little bit about what I did in the book, and then I will move on to the main argument. So, and I wrote down some bullet points here to my left, just to make sure I stress the key arguments. What I analyzed were political arguments in Catalonia and Flanders related to the linguistic controversies in education in Catalonia and in the Flemish periphery of Brussels. And I also connected them to academic arguments around liberalism and nationalism. My research strategy was to combine normative research and empirical work, which is not without challenges. And to do so, I followed the following strategy. I reduced the academic debate on these issues, which is fairly complex, to three main positions: classical liberalism, the communitarian critique, and liberal nationalism. And I operationalized them, if that's a word that we could use here, in a few key ideas that would allow me to approach in a meaningful way the Catalan and Flemish context. And I also personified those three positions in the work of Brian Barry as an example of classical liberalism, Charles Taylor as an example of the communitarian critique, and Will Kimlicka as an example of liberal nationalism. And for Brian Barry and classical liberals in general, I placed an emphasis on the notion of egalitarian liberalism, the idea that liberal justice requires equal treatment, and that the point of liberalism is precisely to try to treat different people the same way, and the mistrust of policies aimed at cultural and national protection because of their potential illiberal risks. That was the way in which I characterized that position. For the communitarian critique, I followed Charles Taylor and his critique of John Rawls' theory of justice for being too insensitive to the ways in which people experience belonging, and the critique to the moral ontology that sees individuals as atomic, as not connected, as not part of a broader network of individual and social connections. Although that critique, it's not about nationalism itself, it's more about the community dimension for individuals. And for Kimlicka, which is the dominant position in the field, I would say, although obviously not hegemonic, as there are some critiques, but his third way around liberal culturalism, and within it, liberal nationalism, is the third position in my theoretical framework, and particularly the way he tries to reconcile classical liberal values around individual rights and individual autonomy with the significance of national membership. That's the framework I have in my book. And then I approach the cases, which are Catalonia and Flanders, each with its own similarities and differences. To me, the key issue that allowed me to compare the cases is that both are sub-state nations where language is a national identity marker, and where sub-state nationalism is charged with illiberalism, charged with, to follow Kimlicka's vocabulary, the illiberal restrictions, internal restrictions, sorry. And there are two parties in particular, two political parties, Ciudadanos in Catalonia and the FI in Belgium, previously FDF, which capture very well this critique on classical liberal grounds. A second point that I found remarkably similar in the two cases are the tensions, which are, on the one hand, the willingness to integrate newcomers in the sub-state nation vis-a-vis migratory waves, which were first internal, people from other parts of Spain, people predominantly from Brussels, and more recently international waves from all over the world, and try to integrate them through the learning of the national language. And that's one of the elements at play. The other one is the accusation that these measures discriminate against part of the population, that population whose language is the majority language in the rest of the state. A third similarity I found was the gap between the political debate, which is very much focused on the Catalan-Spanish dimension or the French-Dutch dimension, and the increasingly heterogeneous and diverse sociolinguistic profile of these populations. And this gap may be explained by institutional reasons and the fact that some of these people coming from other parts of the world do not yet have the ability to shape the political discourse and influence the political process. But this was especially clear in Flanders, where the periphery is becoming internationalized, and it's not so much about French speakers anymore. But then there were so many differences, and with Flanders, the fact that Flemish people are a demographic majority within Belgium makes a big difference. We're talking about a sub-state nation and sub-state nationalism, but one that is not a minority nation or minority nationalism, because 56% of Belgians are Flemish, and language was a federating criteria in 1993 in Article 2 in ways that is not the case in Spain. And then obviously the way in Flanders, the controversy emerges in the only place where French speakers outnumber Dutch speakers. The Flemish movement has succeeded in achieving most of its historical goals, and the current territoriality principle is applied in most of the territory, apart from these few exceptions where controversies arise, and that allows defenders of the Flemish position to adopt a more legalistic or neutral vocabulary just focused on law abidance. And I think one last difference that is quite important is that Flemish nationalism has traditionally adopted more illiberal forms over time, especially around the Second World War. And up until 2004, Vlaams Belang, a far-right party, was the main dominant party of Flemish nationalism, and this is different in the Catalan case. So two cases that have similarities that make them comparable, but also differences that make the comparison interesting. And that's why I went about it. My main argument is that the linguistic controversies in Catalonia and Flanders take place within liberal nationalism. My argument is that the political actors defending and opposing the contested policies share in different ways and to different degrees the view that membership to national groups is important for individuals. This is the core argument of the book, and this is the one I developed especially in the last part of the book. I suggest that the pro arguments, the arguments defending the policies in Catalonia and Flanders are remarkably similar and fall clearly within liberal nationalism through the notion of open integration through language, this idea that in Catalonia, for example, Catalan is the meeting point between residents and newcomers. I found very similar arguments in Flanders, and connects with Kimlicka's view that liberal nations have relatively open criteria of admission. There were also very different linguistic ideologies in both places. We won't be surprised to hear that sub-state nationalist parties made the nation explicit in their claims, while others spoke more ambiguously about country or territory and engaged in consequentialist reasoning. So they defended the policies because they are good for social cohesion or for equal opportunities or for participation of newcomers in social and political life. So different strands of arguments. But also in these arguments, the national frame of reference was always Catalonia and Flanders. That's my interpretation of the data. There are differences too within this common framework of liberal nationalism. One is that in Catalonia, actors have a crucial difficulty, which is that Spanish is the first language of a majority of Catalans. And therefore, arguments built around notions such as Catalonia's own language or Catalonia's common language may immediately be counter-argued with the claim, why could not Spanish be Catalonia's own language or Catalonia's common language, given that it's the first language of a majority of Catalans? While in the Flemish case, it's different. The battle has been won, so to speak, by the movement to a large extent. And so they may just focus on arguments related to the law. A second difference is that in Catalonia, the arguments defending the conjunction model in education are in fact arguments for bilingualism, because virtually everyone speaks Castilian. So arguments defending the presence of Catalan are not arguments built for the exclusion of Spanish. The debate is about the prevalence of one language over another in that territory. In Flanders, again, as in Wallonia, it's territorial monolingualism. And so the debate is about the presence of just one language in the public sphere and in public institutions. These are the arguments in favor of the system. They fall clearly within liberal nationalism. The arguments against are a bit different. So in Flanders, I was very surprised to see that opponents of the linguistic regime adopt explicitly the vocabulary of minority rights. French speakers would claim to be a national minority within Flanders, one united by a common language and a common culture. And they want Belgium to ratify the Framework Convention for the Protection of National Minorities, because they think that would grant them further rights within Flanders. In Catalonia, the arguments are fairly different. Those who oppose the conjunction model adopt a vocabulary that sounds more like classical liberalism, more focused on constitutional rights, on the equal presence of language in education, on individual rights, and so on. However, the point I make about this is that the demand for the equal presence of Catalan and Spanish in the education system crucially depends on the unequal linguistic design established in the Spanish Constitution. That there's a defense of the linguistic design that does not distribute linguistic rights equally, and that also imposes the knowledge of Castilian, which then does not fall under classical liberalism. I also found, especially in my interviewees with civil society organizations, that they opposed the inverted commas nationalist content of school material in Catalonia, because that did not match the inverted commas constitutional reality of Catalonia and Spain. And then I elaborate a little bit about this, and I make the point that constitutions do not transcend nationalism. They codify and normalize particular views around language and nation. So to conclude, I argue that this argumentation scheme is the only one of the four that sounds like classical liberalism, but I suggest that at the same time, it is built upon and necessitates national and cultural aspects included in the Constitution. That's what the book is about.
Okay. Thank you. No, thank you very much for this summary. And I very much welcome this attempt to combine political theory and the empirical cases and a comparative empirical case. I think that this is very much needed research. So thank you for that. I would have a question, which is that, I believe that in addition to different positions on the nationalist conflict, especially regarding Catalonia, there are underlying conceptions of what this conflict is even about. So in this case, Catalan supporters of the linguistic Catalan model would see the conflict as between two nationalism, while critics, as you said, would see it more between liberalism and nationalism. And I broadly see your project of nationalizing liberal nationalism as somewhat being in agreement with the defenders of the Catalan linguistic model. So as arguing that there's both important nationalist understandings in both sides. But I wonder, an issue regarding the empirics, which is if it's maybe not, if it's maybe a bit more complex in the sense that simply to argue that aside, in this case, the critics of the Catalan linguistic model, who are very explicitly avoiding the label of nationalist, and try very, I mean, they try very hard to try not to pose the arguments as sounding anything similar to nationalist arguments. If it's simply to say they're just mistaken, they're just nationalists. So I mean, I agree with the fact that they clearly fail to escape nationalism, but I was wondering if that doesn't prevent us from asking a bit if this is not a more complex situation in which individuals are working within but also against nationalism at the same time. Because I mean, nationalism in the end is an ideology, it structures modernity, is extremely important, but it's not an actual fact of reality, and people can express its opposition in different ways. So, I mean, for example, they might be reproducing some elements of nationalism, in this case, the boundaries of the Spanish nation, while trying to avoid the ethnic content by not establishing their identity on ethnic elements such as language, as the Catalans, as you mentioned, explicitly do base, the notion of Catalan as the language of Catalonia. So aren't they just presenting a set of grievances regarding the Catalanist nation building through the very imperfect language of liberalism?
Yeah, I mean, great critical comment, Javier. I think it's very fair. I think it's a good point. I would start by saying that I agree with you. The controversy is also about what the controversy is about. It's not only about values. I agree with that. I think it is indeed possible to genuinely oppose nationalism as an ideology. And I see your point that you may genuinely oppose nationalism, but insofar as we live in a world of nations, you are almost forced to operate within a system of thinking and an institutional setting that constantly reproduces particular visions on nations. I take your point that I don't go beyond that. And I think at least part of the reason is because I focus on those actors who engage the most with the debate and who shape the debate on language in Catalonia and Flanders. And one of the effects of that is that it overrepresents particular views, those that have stronger positions on this. In the Catalan case, that would be Ciudadanos. And I found it interesting. I thought there was something to be said about the embracement of explicit classical liberal vocabulary and the opposition to nationalism, while at the same time, certainly in the interviews I had with them and in certain civil society organizations close to the party or aligned with them, reproducing a particular idea around the common language of Spain, which should be Spanish, and the fact that Spanish institutions have allowed Catalan institutions to compete too well on the issue of what language should prevail in education and in the public and political sphere more generally. I thought that was interesting. It's something we see in Quebec as well and elsewhere, the adoption of classical liberalism, while at the same time embracing these views. I think if I had focused a little bit more on that position, I would have found more ambiguities, as you were suggesting, I think, in your question, and more ambivalences. And I stopped right there. And I see that that could be a shortcoming, but I also thought it was interesting to highlight that tension or that an awareness, because in a way it points at the direction of banal nationalism and the myth of the civic nation and other concepts in nationalism studies that we are familiar with. And it exposes a certain understanding of nationalism itself, that it is necessarily about sub-state nationalism, it is necessarily about separation and about languages that are different from the state language and so on. That's why I found it interesting to focus on that, but I think you have a point in that I did not go in depth about the different positions about this. I will just conclude the answer by saying that in any case, I did not challenge the legitimacy of their position. I took all the positions very seriously. That's why I spent 4.5 years of my life doing this research and interviewing these actors in detail. I assumed that all of them articulated claims in good faith, and I assumed that their interests and their positions were legitimate. And based on those assumptions, I interviewed them, I read their documents, and so on. So I take your criticism on that particular point
No. I mean, more than criticism, it was just a comment. Maybe to go.
Critical comment.
I mean, it's impossible to do everything in a book, and I think it's. I mean, it's excellent. I'm gonna ask you for a short answer to a short question, and then we'll go on to the questions asked us via Twitter and via the Facebook and Zoom chats. Which is that in addition to your academic work, you've also written extensively on the Catalan conflict for the British media. And this is something that I think is very difficult and that you do a great job. And it's particularly difficult because the Catalan conflict is very difficult. It's very complex with many actors. Two, there's basically every term is ideologically charged. So what happened the 1st of October, is it a referendum, an illegal referendum, an constitutional referendum? And there's so many new terms that are also ideologically charged. So right to decide, for right to self-determination. And then you have to translate all of that for the British context, and kind of that's not that easy because constitutionalism is not really the same as unionism. So I was just wondering, how do you do that in articles of 5 to 1,000 words? Yeah.
I think I benefit from the fact that I engage with media in the UK basically, and it seems to me that the figure of the expert here is a little bit different from the one of the expert back in Catalonia and Spain. So here you are usually contacted when there's a new development on something related to Catalan politics and Catalan independence. And the assumption is, and the expectation is, that you will provide non-partisan, impartial analysis to better understand the dynamics. It seems to me that this figure, while it exists in some cases in Spain, I don't want to make a stark contrast, but it is a little bit different, perhaps because of the way the media system is there, much more polarized, much more party aligned. Usually when experts are approached, they are inevitably asked to take part in the conversations of the day and what's being discussed that day. So I think I've benefited from this context in which I've been engaging with UK media for several years now, and the figure of the impartial analyst is one that I think it's more established here than elsewhere. Also, I think it has benefited me to be here in the sense that I could not assume too much knowledge about the Catalan case because that would not be reasonable, and that forced me to select the information and just focus on what is essential. I could not possibly talk about the different party label changes in Catalan politics over the last 2-3 years, particularly on the center-right sub-state nationalist area, because people's heads would explode, and rightly so. So I do try to focus on the drivers to provide a plausible interpretation of events, and one that is impartial, and by this I mean one that is not partial, that doesn't side with one or the other. I'm fully aware of the fact that the interpretations I will provide will never be neutral, because as you were saying, the vocabulary that we use partly shapes our interpretation of events, and because neutrality in this very controversial and polarized context is not possible and perhaps not even desirable, but offering a plausible interpretation that doesn't side with neither one nor the other, and that provides, hopefully shed some light on the drivers behind political and social dynamics, is my main goal. So I try to do it this way, and I think being here has benefited me for these two reasons.
Thank you for that. So now we'll go to the questions that we've been receiving from Twitter. We've received quite a few, so I just select a couple. So the first question is by Caroline Gray. And she asks, the debate over the immersion system in Catalonia always seems very polarized between those in favor and those against it. So is anyone advocating any form of middle between the two positions?
Advocating any form
of middle road, sorry, between the two positions.
Thank you, Caroline, for the question. There are at the political level, perhaps not so much or not so vocally, but certainly Albert Branchadell comes to mind, a political theorist who has contributed to study this. And he usually makes the point that supporters of the system in Catalonia should be open to make it flexible outside Barcelona and its metropolitan area, perhaps, where the presence of Castilian is less dominant and where it may be necessary, perhaps in some cases, to expand a little bit more on Castilian. If that is eventually necessary, they should be a little bit more open to that. I'm familiar with other people in academia making similar arguments. At the political level, perhaps not so much, although you would expect certain voices within the Catalan Socialist Party and also within the Catalan Greens, which are now currently under the Podemos or in different party labels in Catalonia, would also make similar arguments. But it is remarkable how the arguments don't change too much over time, nor do the positions change too much over time. And the defense of the system is fundamentally consequentialist, based around social cohesion, and the opposition is fundamentally based around the illiberal character of the measure. And the ones who engage the most in the debate adopt these positions, while the ones who would perhaps adopt middle ground positions are the ones who don't engage that much. And perhaps that's the reason why I haven't captured their views as well as the other two.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. We have another question by David Landon Cole, and he asks on the comparison between Catalonia and Flanders, and he asks, Flemish and Walloon are roughly equal in the size within the flag of Belgium, while Catalonia is a relatively small part of Spain, where there is a much larger national identity. How does this affect attitudes towards the nationalness of a national language?
Well, I think that's a great question. Thank you, David, and very, very important. I think that's a significant contextual factor shaping the kind of arguments we see, because from the moment that we try to establish one language as the only state language in Belgium, we would have at least 50% of the population completely against it, because it would not be their language. So in cases such as Belgium, the notion of the national language is completely different. You have three languages standing on equal footing in different territories. It is true that historically there was a window of opportunity to do this in a completely different way. There was nothing necessary about this in the early 20th century when the Flemish movement was gaining strength. There was the possibility of turning Belgium into a bilingual state. And at the time that was opposed by French-speaking elites from Wallonia and Brussels. And therefore we saw the territoriality principle being implemented in the country, with some exceptions such as the linguistic facilities and the fact that the regions and the communities don't match and so on, but that's beside the point. Another way of doing this would be to make Belgium officially bilingual, at least, if not trilingual, to include German speakers. And that would make 2 or 3 languages official throughout the state territory, rather than different territories which are officially monolingual, apart from the Brussels capital region, which is officially bilingual. So it is completely different. While in Spain, certainly the socio-demographic composition allows for the establishment of one national language based on the core dominant folk ethnic group, which would be the Castilian group in this sense, and therefore the turning of Castilian into Spanish as the national language. And where we see controversies in Spain is in those territories which have other languages other than Spanish being recognized as official, and particularly those territories where sub-state nationalist parties are usually in power and therefore implement ambitious linguistic policies, such as in the Basque Country and Catalonia. And it's there in those territories where those two national projects meet and compete for linguistic prevalence that we see it. So a very important point, and I think that's a very important difference between the two cases.
Thank you. Thank you. So there's another question by Jose Javier Olivas, and he asks, I wonder whether the book you're distinguishing between formal arguments for the difference of monolingualism or prioritization of a language in Catalonia, in this case, Catalan, and how in practice some of these liberal ideas are reflected or are played out. So he puts the example of how language and Catalonia can be used as a barrier from those of other parts of Spain or from Latin America, and cannot compete on equal grounds applied to specifically public jobs in the public administration. So I was wondering if you reflected some a bit on these topics.
Yeah, thanks so much for the question. Very relevant. I must admit that in the book I focus exclusively on claims and arguments, and mapping the arguments on these theoretical debates around liberalism and nationalism. I am aware and have read with great interest work of people such as Thomas Jeffrey Miley and others who have looked at this perhaps in greater detail from a more sociological or perhaps political sociological perspective of these factors that play a role, or the implications of certain discourses and policies. And that would make for an interesting debate, but perhaps just to not make it longer, the answer to the question would be that on this particular book, because as you said earlier, Javier, we cannot do everything. I focused on the claims and mapping them in the normative debate around individual and group rights.
Thank you very much. So we'll ask two more questions and then we'll close the event. Athena Lucy makes this question: would you make a distinction between state-level monolingualism and civil society-level bilingualism, where peripheral communities sponsor the teaching of their own language alongside the national official language on schools, and describe this hybrid policy as a liberal policy? And she mentions France as a case where this takes place.
Sorry, I couldn't quite get. So a distinction between state-level nationalism and peripheral.
Basically, I think she's asking a question regarding the state level teaches one language, and then alongside that, peripheral regional communities are allowed to teach other languages, but I think like a different system. Yeah. It's not all state based.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Yes, I think that's not explicit but implicit in the book and in the debates I have. Certainly in Spain, so the linguistic design in Spain is such that the center was kept monolingual by the constitutional legislator in 1978 with very few exceptions. And those territories where languages other than Spanish were present were given the option of choosing between one model that we could call co-official linguistic regime, like 6 autonomous communities at the moment, including Catalonia, the Basque Country, the Valencian community, and so on. And then others which we could call limited recognition, in which the language that is not Spanish enjoys some degree of institutionalization, but it is not officially co-officially in those territories. So that's a very good example of that dual dimension of central institutions being kept predominantly monolingual, but the peripheries being granted the option of doing this. And once again, and just to reiterate an important point of the book, much of the issue has to do in those territories about the prevalence of one language over another, when you have sub-state nationalist parties in office that adopt advanced or ambitious linguistic policy agendas that eventually compete with the presence of Spanish as the only official state language throughout the territory.
Thank you very much. So with this, we're going to ask the last question. This question is asked by Jonathan Hearn, which I think you know very well. So how do the languages involved here relate to civil societies? So I think the cases of Catalonia and Flanders, are there 2 civil societies, or one for each case, 4 civil societies, 1 for each language? So how does this relate to civil societies?
Thank you, Jonathan, for the question. How many civil societies? It's a good question. I had never approached it this way. I would perhaps be tempted to say that there are 3 civil societies in this analysis. The first one is the Catalan, and that one includes defenders and opponents of the system, and both are very active. because in Catalonia there has been a long tradition of civil society organizations around culture, whether it's for one particular position or another, to play an active role in this kind of debates. And certainly the civil society organizations against the Catalan model, even though they are perhaps fairly small, they are very vocal and active and organize different events, publish different reports, and they do take part in the debate. And I think that's one civil society that engages in this debate, and with political parties defending their views. And then I would maybe identify two in the case of Belgium, which do not necessarily engage with each other to the same degree. And that would be the one that is more French speaking, and they were clearly aligned with the FDF, now currently the Fidesz party, that is in many ways a single issue party focused on the defense of the rights of French speakers in Flanders and in other parts of Belgium. And then the Flemish speaking one, in which parties would defend different positions and organizations would defend different positions. So a complex question, but off the top of my head, I would maybe identify those three. And I would make the point that yes, in Belgium, they are further apart after all than in Catalonia.
Thank you very much. And with that, we'll have to close the event. Thank you very much, Dani, for joining us in this discussion. And thank you for all the members of the audience for their participation and the questions. I just want to remind everyone that we have more book presentations planned for the following months. So join us for a panel discussion with the authors of The Struggle Over Borders on the 20th of November, also at 5:30 British Summer Time. And then on the 19th of December, we have an interview with Caroline Gray, also on territorial politics and parties in Spain. So please do join us for these events. Follow us on our social media to be updated about our events, deadlines, and call for papers on nationalism studies, territorial politics, and populism. So thank you very much, and see you next time.